on the drive, a convoy of kindness rolling into his world, helped him start again. When the mountain you're climbing seems never ending, the battle you're fighting you can't win on your own. Look around, there's a world full of angels. Might be the friend you can call in the middle of the night, or the stranger you meet once in your life when your faith's been shaken, heart's been breaking. They help you to leave again in a world full of angels. Hello, I'm Merelyn. Welcome to my Ordinary Angels podcast. This is the fourth filming right here in Tamworth at the 2019 Country Music Festival. It's been a great week. As I've said in each one, people from all over Australia gather together for 10 days of fun and mayhem at the festival. But today, this person hasn't travelled very far at all. Local Tamworth, former Uniting Church minister, or continuing Uniting Church minister, but retired. Wonderful person with a great history. Today we're going to talk about grief. Would you please welcome Tony Winter? Hi, Tony. Great to have you. And you're local.
Yes.
So your driving here was 5 minutes.
Oh, a little more than that. 13, I think.
13.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me today. And
Okay.
you and I have known each other for a few years now. We've worked together in various situations.
We have.
And one of the things that I want to talk to you about and pick your brains about today is the whole topic of grief. Grief is such a huge part of our everyday life.
Sure is.
And affects society and us as individuals in so many different ways. But before we do that, because I know that's one of your focuses has been grief counselling and relationship counselling over the years, just give us a little bit of history. Uniting Church minister. I said former, but that's not true because you're still preaching, lay preaching, but you are officially retired.
Absolutely, and you never retire when you're a minister.
No.
Yeah.
And tell us about the roles you've had in relationship counselling over the years.
Okay, well, I was appointed to Port Hedland in Western Australia to the Pilbara Patrol of the Federal Methodist Inland Mission back in Methodist Church days.
Yes, before the Uniting Church.
Yeah, before the Uniting Church. And I was there from 71 to 73. And I was encountering all kinds of awkward problems that I knew nothing about. And I needed to get some more training. I'd been 10 years in the ministry, and I discovered that about every 10 years I needed to get some more training. So I was fortunate to win a Rotary Foundation scholarship, which sent me to America for a year, and I studied at the feet of some of the authors that I'd been reading in terms of pastoral counselling.
Right.
When I was in college 10 years before.
Right.
So that was a great experience to be able to acquire some more skills from those guys. Yeah. So
Yes.
I then returned to Australia and continued my ministry, first of all at Campbelltown in Sydney, and then into Newtown Mission, right in the heart of the city, where I was dealing again with all kinds of people with all kinds of problems. Yeah.
So, a couple of interesting things you said there. One was about every 10 years you need to re-educate yourself. Do you think that's a generational thing? Because a generation is about, 20 to 30 years?
Yeah.
But within that 20 or 30 years, particularly nowadays, there's a huge change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So was that part of your re-education, or was it also part of your gaining experience the older you got?
Yeah, it was part of my need to get some more training and to branch out and keep learning. I mean, I'm still learning. Hopefully we're all still learning, yeah.
Part of my ethos of Ordinary Angels is to open people and myself up to new perspectives.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what you're identifying there.
Yeah.
To keep growing and to keep serving our community, which is one of the mandates of the Uniting Church ministry.
Absolutely.
It's so important, isn't it, to keep opening ourselves and learning about people and where they're coming from.
Yeah.
So from there?
I had another parish at DY. And then I transferred to Western Australia, where I became deputy head of a university college. And there I was dealing with students who were falling in love, falling out of love. Their parents were divorcing or their grandparents were dying. So I was doing a lot of grief work with students at the college. We had about 170 odd students living there from scattered all over Western Australia who came to the city to study. Yeah.
So was that primarily your role, or did that role develop according to the need?
It developed, yeah, because I saw the need with the students and spent a lot of time just sitting with them and talking about that. And then we had a death in the college. One of the students was killed in a motor accident right outside the college, and
that's a whole lot of layers
that
right
had
there.
a great impact on the students. And many of us went to Geraldton for the funeral because that's where the guy came from.
Right. So that was your continuing journey along this path of counselling into grief?
Yeah, and then I did some work with marriage guidance counselling and did some counselling there. And
there's no grief in marriage?
Oh, no. There's
none at all.
There's grief in separation and all of that stuff. Yeah.
I think there's grief in marriage too, isn't there, all the time? It's certainly complicated.
And so I was then sent to Melbourne to learn to be a mediator. So I established the first family mediation service in WA through Marriage Guidance Council.
Right.
And I discovered that while I was doing mediation for marriage guidance, it was all my friends in the area of counselling who were sending clients to me. And I thought, well, why should I work for marriage guidance when I can work for myself?
Yes.
And so I established a family mediation service at Kingswood College and did some work there with people who were in all kinds of trouble, separating and divorcing and involved in loss issues. I became involved in the WA Association for Loss and Grief, and for a couple of years I was president of that organisation. So I travelled the country attending national conferences on loss and grief and presenting papers at loss and grief conferences. And so that was another growing experience for me. Yeah.
Mm. And then when did you arrive back here in Tamworth?
Well, I came to Tamworth 6.5 years ago and met Annette and fell in love and settled.
Yes,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Annette being the lovely lady over there, which the camera's not going to see, but your lovely wife.
Yeah.
So during that time, I know from having many chats with you over the last few years that you were counselling in this grief situation, you were counselling in marriage relationships, you were counselling in wider relationships, and all this time you were suffering from your own private grief, as we all do. Was that a huge part of your learning curve? Because sometimes we think that people who are counselling in these areas have got it all together in these areas,
Absolutely.
Right? But that's rarely the case.
Absolutely.
Because life just keeps throwing stuff at us.
Yeah, and unless you deal with your own stuff,
Yeah.
there is no way you can help other people. Yeah.
So how did you deal with that? Because you became a marriage counsellor
Yeah.
when you'd already been through a divorce.
Yeah.
You had some loss and grief around your teenage years when
Yeah.
your family moved away.
Yeah.
And you had to deal with what that meant, moving away from the community you grew up in.
Yeah.
Tell us about some other times in your life where major impact of grief. And it doesn't have to be a major event, does it?
No.
Grief can come from the smallest things.
My memory says that my first experience of grief was when my family decided to move from Junee, where I was born, and moved to Sydney. And I can remember standing at the window of the train watching my town go by as the train moved out of the town. And my dog was back there.
Oh!
Yeah. So
That's enough
that
grief.
was my first experience. And then when I was about 9, my second eldest brother had an appendectomy operation and he died about 8 weeks later.
Yeah.
And he was my hero. And,
Yeah.
and it was really sad and
Yeah.
and I was unable to grieve properly then because I don't know why. I remember coming home from school with my younger brother Len, and we came in the back door, and my mother and my sister was home from work. My sister was home. Why was she home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
You knew something was wrong.
And they were crying, both of them, walking around the kitchen doing things. And we said, "What's wrong?" And they said, "Elwyn has died." So Len immediately rushed to Mum and threw his arms around her and buried his head in her breast and cried. And I thought, "Oh, he's crying. I better try and cry too."
How old were you?
I was 9 and I couldn't cry.
Right.
Then about 17 years later, when my father died, and I was living in Tamworth at the time, and I drove from Tamworth to Canberra, where my parents lived. And the only picture I had on my mind was my brother, Elwyn, who had died.
So that grief was rising again.
And it was though my body was saying, you cannot grieve the loss of your dad until you really grieve the loss of your brother. So I remember pulling over on the side of the road near Lake George and climbing out of the car and sitting on a log or something, and I cried and really sobbed for 2 hours.
17 years later.
Yeah. So grief happens for people at different times, and you can't put a time limit on it and say, this happens, that happens, then
or a process.
Yeah. It's a process that you go through. And everybody does it at their own pace. Yeah.
Sometimes we try to force people to grieve because we want to be able to move on.
Yeah.
With them moving on as well.
Yeah.
So these experiences, and we mentioned earlier you went through a divorce, they're big things.
Yeah.
But I don't know what you think, but I've come to this understanding of grief for me is that a seed is sown early in our life. And like you said, at 9 you weren't able to grieve that as healthily as you needed to. And then, but even if we do grieve a bit, there's often another bit of grief comes in and another bit. And to me, it seems like for some people, there just becomes layer upon layer upon layer until they are so laid down with grief that they become depressed and sometimes suicidal. And it's like, it feels like to me, and I've been there, so I'm recalling my own feeling that I was just squashed down.
So much was happening.
Yeah. And I found that I needed to be the type of person that I am. I needed to start having some education around grief and start understanding that there are layers and there are certain behaviours that are normal with grief and we shouldn't be hiding them.
Absolutely right.
And then start to peel back those layers. And that's a very painful thing for a lot of people. But when you can get back to those early layers of grief, suddenly all the rest seem to fall into place for me. Yeah. What do you think about, there's lots of, and I was actually Googling this again this morning because I've often talked with people about the 5 stages of grief. And let me just read them out so I get them absolutely correct. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Now, as I was Googling today, just to get some more information on these, now they're saying there's 7 steps and 9 steps. So they're breaking that down even further. Yeah. But let's stick to the basic 5 because that's what a lot of people understand.
Yeah, Kubler-Ross first said these were the stages. Yeah, she was writing the first book on grief, and she said these were the 5 stages. Yeah. And then she wrote that there's another stage, and that's moving on.
Right. Yeah. Yes, which is great. Yeah. Not just acceptance, but moving forward. Yeah. So in all your years and your personal experience of grief, and you've got the education behind it and a lot of study and a lot of working with a lot of people going through all sorts of types of grief and different responses. Do you have a definition of what grief is? Oh,
I think that's the important thing is to keep it simple, and any feeling or emotion of loss is the basic understanding of grief. If you've lost something, you automatically emotionally respond to that loss. You know, a woman loses her wedding ring. Like, where is it? I've got to search the house and find it. It's any feeling of loss.
And do you find that sometimes when we see people's overreaction to something that we would consider to be reasonably minor in terms of loss, sometimes we can say, oh, come on, move on. Don't worry about that. That's just, glass broken or something. But apart from the emotional connection that item might have that's lost, the wedding ring or something, do you find that it really gives us an opportunity, if we have unresolved grief, to go back and tap into that?
Yeah.
It's that little trigger that says...
It's the trigger.
You're not okay underneath. There's actually more going on.
Yeah.
What's been some of your experiences with helping people through that? How do you approach? If I came to you today and said I'm grieving, and it might be something obvious, would you help me look beyond the obvious?
It's interesting. The thought that comes to me was when I was ministering in Newtown Mission. I never went to the church office on a Saturday, but one Saturday I went there for something or other, and a knock on the door, and a woman came in. She came from a country town out in the bush, rural person, and she sat down. I said, come in, sit down and have a talk. And she told me that her sister was in Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, very sick. They didn't know what was wrong with her, and she feared that her sister was going to die, and she had a number of children, I can't recall how many, and it meant that she would have to look after those children if she died. And huge stuff was going on for her. And she'd come in from the country, from, I think, Warren,
Right.
And she talked about her fear of what might happen for her and her family, but also what might happen if her sister dies, and she would be experiencing that loss of her, the companionship of her sister and all of that.
So is what you're saying out of that it's never simple, is it?
It is never simple.
Because she'd be grieving for her sister and grieving for her family who'd be missing the loss of the sister. But then she was also grieving that her lifestyle would change and she'd have a loss of lifestyle. Yeah. And it'd be interesting because, I reckon it would be hard to express something like that, because you'd be thinking, well, I'm being selfish. My sister's dying and her family are going to have to deal with that. And here I am thinking about my loss of lifestyle. But it's so important to identify whatever level of grief is there, because if that was unresolved, that would very much go on to affect her relationships with those children and with the sister's husband if you had one, and the wider family, and could turn easily into resentment.
Absolutely. She was there was a bit of that
already happening,
wrapped up in all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And I saw her a number of times while she was still in Sydney, and while her sister was still in, and I saw the sister in the hospital as well. So there was ongoing stuff for probably 3 or 4 weeks while the sister was in hospital. She went home again.
Oh, she didn't die?
No.
Lovely.
Yeah.
That was nice.
Yeah.
But interesting that the lady, and I suppose that probably brought up a lot of things for her in preempting that grief.
Absolutely. And the other dynamic for me was that at that stage I was doing some more counselling training with in a psychiatric hospital with the chaplain there who was tutoring me in my counselling, extending my counselling training. Right. And I used some counselling techniques that he'd been teaching me with her. Yes. And it worked. Yeah. Like, wow. Right. It really helped her to open up and tell me the story. And I got a lot of those feelings out of her because of the way I responded to her need. Yeah.
So it's definitely a good thing to go, if you're really suffering grief, to go to someone who has some grief counselling experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what I loved about what you just said then, you said my favourite words was, I heard her story.
Yeah.
Because a story, when you're in grief, telling your story is really, really, really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. To be able to verbalise what's going on inside is very therapeutic, and to get it out and be able to look at it like that. Yeah.
So when we're looking at the 5 steps, or the 6 moving on, It's a very slippery slope, though, isn't it? One of the things that I've learned from my own experience and with people is that it's not that you have denial and then that's done and I'm moving into anger and then now I'm depressed and then I'm bargaining, or bargaining's next actually, then depression and then acceptance. They go hand in hand and backwards and forwards. And
it's a roller coaster.
Yeah.
Because you're going up and down and dips and turns, and sometimes you're this, sometimes you're that, sometimes you're both of those things, and it doesn't happen like step by step.
No.
It's a mixture there, and that's very confusing for people.
And other things come into play because people around you are likely grieving as well.
Yep.
So they could be having their anger day while you're having your bargaining day, and we could clash very much.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what role do you think unresolved grief has in the wider community? Because for people individually, if we have grief that's unresolved, and I guess most of us do, I feel like after some fairly major things going on in my life over the years, I feel like I have pretty good strategies to deal with grief. And people go, what? How do you get that? But when you've been hit lots of times, you do actually have strategies. And I've been talking to some people just this week in Tamworth that they go, yeah, this has been a really tough time. I've got a friend who lost a baby. And she said it's been really tough, but I've learnt so much and I've got some great things out of it. This is why tears are streaming.
Yeah.
You know, she was able to identify her grief and go, I know I have to grieve, but I'm actually working through to a resolution on this grief and I'm grieving healthily. And that's a wonderful thing because we can then help others.
Sure.
What role do you think in society does unresolved and resolved grief? What are the ripple-on effects?
Well, if you don't deal with it, it'll come out in all kinds of ways. It'll come out in your body, in some kind of illness or some kind of
very common
stuff that happens to you. Yeah, it is very common. And if you don't deal with it, it appears in some of the things you say to people. It appears in your behaviour. It appears in all kinds of ways that you do not really recognise and understand.
Happening at a subconscious level.
Yeah.
And when you were counselling people, did you recognise those triggers, like those indications?
Oh yes, it's very clear when you're able to sit back and observe. It comes out in your gestures. It's the way it comes out in all kinds of different ways that it's evident if you sit back and just. And the other thing that's important, if you really listen to that person, you know, sometimes all you have to do is to be a big fat ear and let them talk and tell you what it is that's going on for them.
And that's enough sometimes, isn't it?
Sometimes that's enough, yeah.
I've got this theory that we all have... We feel like we have lots of questions that we don't get answers for. I actually feel like we have the answer to all our questions inside us, but we don't always know what the question is. And if we can have that ability to just spill ourselves and tell our story, tell the story of what we're grieving, whether it's a person or a job or moving or relationship, leaving your dog behind, all of those things that do cause quite severe grief. If we're able to put that together, sometimes those questions, the questions that we're really asking, come out.
Yes.
Do you find that the main question for people is eventually going to be, can I get through this? Or is there a common question?
I don't know whether there's a common question, but can I get through this is often the question that I remember sitting with the students who wanted to have a vigil when Graham died in this car accident.
Yeah.
And they came to me and said, can we have a candlelight vigil? And they sat around on the floor in a big circle and everybody brought a candle. There must have been 50 or 60 kids, teenagers. And they lit their candles and they just sat. And they must have sat for 20 minutes in silence. And their questions were there. milling around in their minds, and it didn't really start to come out until the end of this vigil. They started to talk with one another,
Right.
and the talking with one another, they told stories about this young man who had been a member of their community, and now he was no longer there.
And that, if you looked at that as a micro society right there,
Yeah,
what they were doing there was giving themselves time to absorb it,
yeah,
process it,
yeah.
work out what their
Yeah.
questions and their answers were, perhaps,
Yeah.
and then share the story together. So it was very much a community thing.
Exactly. And it was a long while after
Right.
he had the accident
Right.
that this happened. He
Right.
was in hospital for, I think,
Oh, he didn't die immediately.
No, he was in hospital in a induced coma for about 3 weeks, and the hope that the parents would say, well, we're hoping that he'll come out of this.
Yeah,
But-
that's a terribly hard
but-
time.
And about after 2 weeks, this is when the vigil happened. So
Right.
there was a will he or won't he live kind of...
But they were grieving. They were getting their grief
the
out.
grief was starting,
Yeah.
Yeah. And some of them were feeling guilty about what had happened because he ran out from behind a bus. They'd been out on a party and he ran out from behind a bus. Somebody said, we need some money for the telephone or something like that. And
Right.
he said, I'll go and get it. And he ran out and the car came by.
Right.
So
So they were dealing in their own...
yes.
Yeah. So that's part of, I guess, when we go through denial, we go, oh, that person isn't dead, or they can't be, or what could have I done differently?
Yep, yep.
That can go into the anger, if only I'd done this, what if I'd done that? You shouldn't have done this.
Everybody plays the if only game in
Yeah.
grief.
Yeah.
If only it happened,
Yeah.
just as well. They also play the just as well game. Just as well, he didn't die 3 weeks ago because there was that wedding that he attended. His daughter was getting married. Those kinds of if only games and just as well games are played.
Right, which is the bargaining, isn't it, a bit?
Yeah, it is bargaining. Yeah.
And then I think sometimes when we're in grief, if it's not resolved grief, if we've lost something that we could possibly get back, we do the whole, I'll do this. And sometimes that's the only time we talk to God, right?
Oh, yeah.
A lot of bargaining going
Yeah.
on with this God that some people don't even believe in.
Yeah.
And suddenly
Still-
that becomes the important thing.
Still
Yeah.
they say that, yeah.
Yeah, the bargaining. If only, I'll do this if you could just bring them back. It's a very natural reaction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of like we want to do something to fix it. We want to
Yes.
fix this pain that's inside us.
I should have done that, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the depression, well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because all that comes crashing down on us, and it's that
Yeah.
heavy weight again of, I'm depressed and I'm feeling like I can't get through this. And then somewhere the glimmer of acceptance starts to come in, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe we get some of those answers to the questions that we're asking.
Well, it could be that, or it could be, people talk about time heals this.
Yes.
And it could be the time bit.
Yeah.
And people have a chance to think about and deal with those questions, like I should have, but I really couldn't have.
Yes. Sometimes
Realistically.
we need someone else to say, you know what, that's a great thing that you might have wanted to do that, but
Realistically,
yeah,
it
that
couldn't
wasn't
have.
possible.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we get to the point of going, well, actually, I couldn't have done anything
Yeah,
differently.
yeah.
Yeah, in terms of losing a person in particular.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular advice? And obviously you do, because you've done this for a lot of years with people. Is there something, if someone's newly in grief, or if there's someone out there watching that is really feel like they are under that burden of layers and layers and layers of grief? There's no simple solution, I know. But what would be some advice you would give us for somebody who's grieving? Because grief just, if it's unresolved, it goes on and affects every aspect of our life.
Sure.
Can ruin our relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can cause us to act in ways that we would not have otherwise acted. Affects your health, like you said. We can see the effects of society out in society, can't we, of unresolved grief. So what advice, we want to grieve healthily, which is getting to the acceptance and the moving forward. Have you got some
What
advice?
you're talking about is good grief.
Good grief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And good grief comes when you talk about it. You know, whatever it is that's going on inside your mind, talk about it. Find somebody that's got a good listening ear and talk to them about it. And tell them what's going on inside your guts, because that's going to be a healing process. Talk about it. Say it out loud. I can remember when my mother died and I was living in Perth at the time. I flew to Canberra for the funeral, then flew back, and I was in grief, and I didn't have a job, I was living in a unit, and I was lonely, I was isolated, and I walked past a mirror in the unit, and I looked in the mirror and saw my face, and I was crying, and I just stayed there in front of the mirror and cried, and I said to myself, I know I have to go through this, so I'm just going to cry. And I cried and
gave yourself permission to grieve.
Yeah. And it's okay to give yourself permission to grieve. It's okay to give yourself permission to lie on the ground and stamp your feet and yell and scream if you want to.
Yeah.
Whatever fits, do it.
Yeah.
But if you can find somebody to actually talk to, they don't have to give you any information or any advice. It's just all you need is a big fat ear.
Yes.
And talk into that ear and get it all out, because that's therapeutic.
Yes.
Yeah. And you, in the talking, you're saying to yourself what it feels like. Yeah.
And if we do this and we still find ourselves in a place that's not working for us, there's some great professional bodies out there to help people.
Yeah.
Can you name a few for us? I know there's a lot, right? But
there's
Lifeline would be one place to call straight away.
Lifeline and Beyond Blue, and there's Relationships Australia.
Yes.
And there's Centrelink counselling service, and
right.
And there are a number of counselling services.
And every area has their one for that area too, where you can go in face to face. And there are definite specific grief counsellors as well
associated with those organisations.
So your advice would be to
get some help if you haven't got somebody that you can go and talk to.
Yeah. Or even if you have, if it's not resolving for you.
Yeah,
because like we said, it can bring up all these other issues, and there might be other things that we need to do and have some strategies and take steps towards healing ourselves fully. And sometimes the grief is the catalyst to do that.
Yeah.
When the mountain you're climbing seems never ending, the battle you're fighting.
So Tony, when it comes to organisations that people can tap into to help them through these hard times in their life, I know that you have some history with one of the main ones.
Yes, I was one of the first Lifeline counsellors. I was a student at Central Methodist Mission with the Reverend Alan Walker, who was the superintendent then, and he used to lecture us. And he came in one morning and he was very tired. And he said he'd been on the phone all night. People had been ringing him up all night because he was a very public figure. He was often on television. He had this television program called I Challenge the Minister, and people used to ask questions of him. And
he was taking personal phone calls all night?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he was in the newspaper often. He'd be quoted in the newspaper. So people knew him, and people got the idea, I'll ring Alan Walker and find out, and I'll get some help from him. So he came in tired and he said, I'm so tired. We've got to do something about providing care for people in the city. We've got to do what John Flynn did with the Outback. We've got to cast a mantle of safety over Sydney. Yeah. And we've got to use the telephone, and say help is as close as the telephone. And he said, no, let's call it Lifeline.
Wow.
And Lifeline was formed as he was kind of talking to us in a lecture, and when Lifeline actually got going, we were asked to apply to be counsellors, and we did a course with the organisation. And by this time, I was a student at theological college, so I used to come in to the city to the Lifeline office, and Friday night was my night on, and I'd bring a pile of books to study in case the telephone. I never opened a book. I was on the telephone all night on Friday night,
So the need
talking
was
and
there.
listening to people
Yep.
as they rang in. One guy rang in one night and said, "Well, here I am." And I said, "How can I help you, sir?" He said, "Well, just a prayer." He said, "I always ring in at this time every night for a prayer."
Oh,
And I said, "Okay, so what would you like us to pray about?" So he told me what he wanted to pray about. And so we had a prayer and hung up, and he was satisfied.
and that's that connection, because some people don't have any other connection,
Yeah.
do they?
Yeah,
to the outside
exactly.
world. Some people are very shut in, not just in grief, but in life in general.
This guy was obviously living alone. He was going to bed, and he wanted somebody to say a prayer with him before he went to sleep.
That's beautiful. And so
Yeah.
you were there at the inauguration of Lifeline,
Yeah,
which is now
yeah.
a huge part of Australian. Is it a national
International organisation.
International
Amazing. Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
That's very exciting to remember
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Has it been a worthwhile, rewarding career for you? Because even in your role as Uniting Church Minister, you weren't specifically grief counselling, but I can imagine you're dealing with a lot of grief just because you're dealing with people.
Well, I think I lent towards that area of work, partly because of, I guess, my own experience as a young lad and the experience I had with the loss of my brother and other experiences of loss in my life. It's about being available to people who are experiencing that loss that's important, I think. And I think I've just lent in that direction. But the overall involvement of listening to people has been a joy in my life. You know, people, as you say, people have stories they want to tell, and to listen to stories is just amazing.
I'm going to go out on a not very large limb, because I think that I'm going to say that I'm going to identify in you that that's been one of your gifts. And maybe it is because of the way you were shaped early on, but a lot of people have those experiences and don't end up in grief counselling.
Yeah.
You obviously have a heart for people, and I would say that when you help people, that's a great joy for you and
Yes.
part of your motivation to keep going.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, we want to encourage anybody who's listening, and if you are suffering from grief at any level, to tell your story, find someone to talk to. I always like to talk about the circle of trust.
Yeah.
But not everybody has a comfortable circle of trust. Sometimes we need to
That's
look
right.
outside of that.
That's right.
Get some help. Look up in your local area, or if you're really in grief, ask somebody who you trust to help you find the right person for you to go and have some counselling and to be able to work through this. And I think just knowing that it's a very slippery slope. We go forward and backwards and forward and backwards. There's nothing that's ever very simple in the grief process. And I think the best advice that I give myself whenever I face a new grief situation is to be kind to myself.
Absolutely, yes. That's why I said it's okay to lie on the floor and yell and scream, or look in the mirror and yell and scream. Do whatever fits for you to get that emotion and that feeling and that anger or whatever feeling out. It's important.
It's a pressure valve, isn't
Yep,
it?
it's a
Don't
pressure
let it build
valve.
up.
Yep. You see it on the tennis court with these tennis players at the moment, where they yell and scream or bang their racket on the ground, just to ease the tension.
And in fact, a lot of societies have very good rituals and traditions of wailing and allowing that grief to come out. We're a bit stoic here in Australia, and perhaps doesn't do us the biggest of favours. But really encourage people to get that out in whatever way is appropriate to them, and to seek help. Well, we're coming to the end of our interview, and I've asked you a lot of questions. One of the things I like to do is you get to ask me one question.
Oh, I haven't thought about this.
Should have pre-warned you on that. But you know me well enough to spring one on me.
So, is there anything at the moment for you that you are feeling anxious about?
Oh, we're going to have a counselling session with me on air. Not bad idea. Actually, Tony, I actually feel that the last 20 years of my life there's been some major hurdles for me. And David and I have worked through many of those things together. And I feel that even though grief is a constant part of our lives, that I feel I have some very good strategies.
Good.
Doesn't mean I don't rock in the corner when something new happens,
Yeah.
but I understand that I can rock in the corner for a bit, and then so far I've been able to get up and understand these stages and find that person to tell my story to, those people. Doing what I do, I get to talk all the time, which is really great. But yeah, I find that having those strategies is really important. And I'm actually pretty grateful for all the grief situations I've had in my life, because I think it gives me empathy and understanding for other people. And maybe I'm just a little bit more compassionate person because of it.
And growth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't take those things, if you don't take something good away from each of those difficult situations, I think it's a waste of an opportunity to grow. Sometimes they take a couple of years to get to that lesson, right? What have I learnt from this, and how am I moving forward?
Yeah.
But I've also learnt to give myself permission to take time to do that. I'm not trying to rush it. My sister-in-law lost her husband at 31 years of age with a 4-week-old baby and a 2-year-old toddler. And I was one of the first people to be on the scene. He just died in his bed, and they called me, and I lived close, so I went over, and I actually was there when the coroner came, and I zipped the bag up, and I leant over and I kissed him. His name was James, to say goodbye. And I remember that feeling of coldness, and it was a bit of a shock to me. But I think that for me was the starting point. I went out and I talked to my sister-in-law, and I said, you know, this was a few weeks later after this, I've been talking all that time, but I said to her at one point in time, I was over there, and I said, you just must want to feel better. She said, no, I need to go through this, and I need to live each step, because I need to honour James, and I need to get to my point of moving forward when I've grieved him fully and healthily. And I was only a young person at the time too, and that was a really big thing for me, and that was a healthy response, and I've taken some of that on.
That's good grief.
That is very good grief.
Yeah. Yeah.
Tony, Ordinary Angels is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and your contribution in your 80 plus years helping people through grief. I just want to thank you for that and say, Tony Winter, you are today my Ordinary Angel. Thank you.